Don't wait. You need to get started. And even if you are already started and you're looking at things that you're doing, how are things going? Evaluate where you are and set goals and milestones. That here's when we need to have our supplier partners on board, and that directly affects the things that your teams will be doing. And so what things can you get started on? And then once you get that supplier data, how can you enhance and build on that and collect the things that you need to collect? So I would say, don't wait until everything's perfect. Get started now.
You're listening to Food Tech Talk, Supply Chain Insights from Farm to Fork, a podcast discussing the latest trends and technologies in the food and supplements industries, brought to you by Trustwell, featuring conversations with regulatory experts, quality and safety champions, and thought leaders across the industry. I'm your host, Lydia Adams, VP of Marketing at Trustwell. If you're loving the conversation, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned to the end of the episode where you'll hear our guests tell us their key food industry predictions for 2025. All right, let's jump right in. On today's episode of Food Tech Talk, Supply Chain Insights from Farm to Fork, we're delighted to be joined by Julie McGill, Vice President of Supply Chain Strategy and Insights here at Trustwell. As a longtime leader in traceability and regulatory engagement, Julie has been working directly with companies navigating FSMA 204 and shaping strategies that move past compliance checklists into operational improvements. And today we'll be talking about the FDA's extended deadline, what that means in practice, and how leading companies are using this time to build smarter, more resilient supply chains. Welcome to the show, Julie.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
For those that maybe don't know you, I know most people do, but for those that don't, you've been here at Trustwell for 8 years, and you serve as our FSMA 204 experts, doing consulting, helping businesses. But I'd love to hear more about your background to let people know how you got here.
Thanks so much. The journey to FSMA 204 and getting to this level of expertise really has been, a longer journey, which started with the Food Safety Modernization Act. So FSMA has been around since the early 2000s, finalized in 2011. But ahead of that was a lot of industry work. And at the time, I was actually at GS1 when that occurred. And so there was a lot of activity, work being done with the FDA to understand how is the industry operating today, what standards are in use, whether that be barcodes for products, whether that be EDI for sharing information about the movement and sale of products. So big picture here at Trustwell, yes, I serve as I'm our FSMA 204 expert. I also do quite a bit of work with our product team focused around things like traceability and supply chain management, data governance, because I bring that history from my time at GS1. So when I came to Food Logic, I was at GS1 for 16 and a half years. I worked with grocery, food service, convenience retail, manufacturers, distributors, operators, grocers, and really was focused on some things that were new at the time. I'm going to date myself. So in 2000, there was this company called Transora, and it was a company that had been formed by manufacturers. So think like Procter & Gamble, and at the time Gillette, which was, a standalone company, Reckitt Benckiser, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Kraft Foods, Heinz, all of these industry giants who had come together. And this hub was everything from order management systems, couponing. There were tools for logistics and transportation. And it really was a hub where you would be sharing all of this information over the internet, which at the time, you have to remember, was really taking off as far as our business, running our businesses and our business processes. So from that, Transora had become a data pool. So the Global Data Synchronization Network, Transora, UCCnet, there were a number of different data pools. At the time, it was a much smaller number than it is today. But I worked on the data pool on the Transora side. And so big picture, helping companies to standardize their product information. And that was for the entire item hierarchy. So the eaches, the cases, interpacks, et cetera. And then they would share that information on this network called the GDSN. And so literally I was beginning, when the GDSN was formed and the founding members of the GDSN and implementing that right from the very beginning. And at the time, we had a lot of industry partners sitting at the table, really hashing it out. What attributes are we going to share? It was new. So we were taking data from behind companies inside their four walls and sharing it on the cloud, which was just unheard of. So helping companies do that. And then from that, as FSMA came into place, then I started working on traceability programs and helping companies understand what critical tracking events were and how to identify key data elements and those data attributes that were associated with those different activities. So it was nice that because GS1 was working alongside the FDA, we see a lot of that language in FSMA and in FSMA 204. CTEs and KDEs are now part of our daily conversations when we talk about traceability. And then if I take one more hop back in my food and beverage career, prior to coming to Transora and then GS1, I had worked at Coors Brewing Company out in Golden, Colorado. And so I worked on the IT side of their business, but we worked on something called store level data. And so we were collecting data via EDI, an electronic system that we had built for the distributors, the beer distributors, to send information about their sales electronically back to corporate. And so Coors had a program, Miller had a program, Budweiser had a program. And it was interesting because that whole idea of like using standards, et cetera, there were a couple distributors that might be, say, a Miller Coors house. And so we both had EDI programs. And at the time, it's like, you can use either one, but big picture, we need to capture this data. And so you're going to use this standard to share this data with partners. And so it's interesting how, that was, I'm going to date myself, that was like 95, 97, 2000. And then here we are 25, 30 years later, and we're still talking about using standards to share data about things that are happening in our supply chains.
Introducing Ask Reg by Trustwell, your AI-powered regulatory assistant from food safety to nutritional labeling. Get fast, accurate answers backed by verified sources across the US, Canada, EU, and more. Just $299 per year and get 25% off with code podcast25. To claim your discount, visit the link in the show notes. Yeah, just to be part of the origin story of traceability in so many different ways and creating those standards, working for a company that's saying, how are we going to put this together? And then, moving into where you are now is really incredible. So let's talk about specifically FSMA 204, just because I know it's been a topic for, a while, years. But we're at this different place now with it. And so maybe talk us through kind of like that part of the role and how far we've come and where we are today.
Right. And when we talk about things like traceability and traceability data sharing, right? FSMA 204 is the food traceability rule. Oftentimes you'll hear it referred to as the FTR, FSMA 204 also being the section of the Food Safety Modernization Act. But big picture, when we look at that area of focus, most of the attributes that are part of FSMA 204, for example, when we talk about a shipping event, are things you already share today. Ship from, ship to, the date that the event occurred, the products, the quantities. But now they need enhanced traceability information. So what's changing, it's not that we're sharing data. We do that today, right? You need that information to receive the truck, unload the truck, et cetera. But now I'm going to give you even more information that's very specific to those boxes or bins, those bags that are on that truck that are going down to the lot code, that are going down to traceability lot code source, right? Which is where was that lot code assigned? And those pieces of information are actually pieces of data that are going to allow the FDA to move faster during the event of a withdrawal or a recall event, if there's an investigation where they're able to hop back 2 or 3 steps in the supply chain much faster than having to wait for partner number 1 and then partner number 2 and partner number 3. So the vision that has always been there is, let's not duplicate processes. We are enhancing things that we were already doing. I think the other thing with FSMA 204 is that it's really tightening up roles and responsibilities. So when we talk about those 7 critical tracking events, there's things that we do at the farm. There's things that we do in the processing facilities or in the cooling sheds. And then we get to, the vessels and the boats and the ports, and then on to warehouses and grocery stores and restaurants. And, the FDA has done a very good job of clearly defining what are those activities where we need to collect this information, and then what are the corresponding attributes for each of those activities. Some of those attributes, many of those attributes, we're already collecting today when we do harvest or cool or pack items. But again, some of that enhanced data, that's where companies are trying to figure out, where am I going to store, how am I going to capture it, where am I going to store it, how am I going to share it? And that kind of ties into the extension, which is companies need more time to prepare.
I wanted to talk about the extension, because I think a lot of folks were waiting to see what was going to happen. And now that they do have, those additional, 30 months at the time the extension was released. So, what can they do now? They have more time. What are you seeing as the most productive way to use this time?
So definitely you don't want to sit back. That's the first thing I will say. I've been to several conferences this year where members of the FDA team have talked about the extension. They've addressed it. So the first thing is, it is a proposed extension. If you go to the FDA's website, and even on the FSMA 204 landing page, they have a link to the details of the extension, but now it's in the Federal Register. So now we're kind of moving into that formal process where they've put in the terms of, here's what the extension would entail. There's a public comment period that's underway right now, and companies have until, I believe it's September 8th to submit their public comments. Then the FDA has to review comments, and then they will finalize. Once they finalize this, then that new date of July 2028 will be official. So right now, think of it as we're still in discussions, but we're heading in that direction. It's not official. It's not officially approved yet, but we're heading in that direction. So the FDA has said at many meetings this year, we see this as a time for companies to refine their processes, to ensure that their data is accurate, that they are adding this to their standard operating processes. So it's giving you time to take that traceability plan that you've put together and the systems and processes that you have changed or updated and make sure that it works. Because when we get to 2028, and we turn the lights on and now compliance is required, the expectation is that companies will, not only you will be ready, but your trading partners as well. That we've got that piece in place where suppliers are ready, receivers are ready, and everyone across the supply chain is ready to go.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the topic being discussed at a lot of conferences this year. I've heard, a lot of companies talking about really accelerating at this point and not hitting pause on, the plans that they had made. Is that also kind of what you've heard from a lot of, these big players in the industry?
So companies are definitely, most big companies that I've heard speak about this have said, we are continuing to move forward. We are continuing with our original timelines, and there's several reasons for that. Number one is, if I'm a large distributor, I have thousands of suppliers that I need to connect to. So it's going to take me the better part of these next 30 months to get them onboarded, to get them onto our new program. The second piece is that a lot of these companies have other businesses that they own. So that if I'm a distributor, for example, I not only distribute products, I also own manufacturing facilities. I also have retail stores that I own. So it's not just about connecting with my supplier partners. I also have to get my own business ready to collect this information. And for many in the supply chain, I have to share data with my partners. So I have to align with their programs and the asks that they have in place, the systems that I need to connect to. So that's another component of this. So it's not just about getting my own company ready. There are things that I need to consider both on what comes into my facilities and then what goes out of my facilities.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think about those that have a lot of suppliers, like you said, and really you can't have that traceability if you haven't talked with them and made those plans. So, would you recommend that as kind of like a first step for people that are maybe feeling like, a little bit overwhelmed by the process, or, how should they start?
I say for many companies, First is get educated, right? You need to be familiar with the rule and you need to understand what is my role or what are my roles, plural, as far as, what part of my business is covered by the rule. And so getting that education piece is absolutely key. But then working with your customers to understand, and many of them have sent out their Dear Valued Supplier letters. So going through and pulling all of those together to understand what are my partners, who's ready now, what are they asking for, and also what are their timelines. A number of partners that have active traceability programs in place today are doing very structured implementation programs. So they're asking things like, update your product data and tell me which items are on the food traceability list. Use this flag to tell me what's on the FTL. Then I want to understand, how are you labeling your products today? Am I going to be able to scan these items and get that extended lot information? Not required by the FDA, but for my program, I need this. And that's a standard that many partners are asking for. So you want to make sure that, hey, my partners are asking for these things. Are my partners aligned with the standards? The next piece is, what are the data methods they're asking for? Some customers are asking you to use things like EDI, so they're enhancing existing programs. But other companies have said, hey, we don't have the resources or the systems internally. We're going to use a third party like a Food Logic platform, right, to collect and consolidate our traceability data. And so understanding what are the ways that I can connect with those tools. And many trading partners are currently holding supplier webinars where they're educating on this. And they're letting you know, here's our program, here's our timelines, here's our tools. So you want to make sure that as you're getting engaged, you understand, like I said, what is your role in the supply chain? Who do you work with today and what things are they asking for? And then that third pillar is, how are you going to manage this? What is your company doing today? Because I will say many companies in the food industry today have grown through mergers and acquisitions. They have legacy systems. They have data. My product data lives here. My location data lives here. My transactional data is over here. Logistics is over here. Warehouse management systems over here. And none of those systems talk today. And so making sure that you understand, what do we collect today and how do I need to bring that data together for FSMA compliance?
You bring up one of the potential roadblocks, I think, that folks can run into with having data in various places. It's not something you can pull very easily, and that integration. What other roadblocks are you seeing? I mean, it could be early in the process or in the middle of the process that people are experiencing, and kind of how can they mitigate that?
A big topic right now in the food industry, as well as at the FDA, is data accuracy. So when projects like this occur, one of the things that very quickly gets exposed is how good or how bad is your data. And so if I go back to my early days of GDSN, that required a lot of data cleanup because companies' product data lived in multiple systems. They had duplicate data, and sometimes that data did not match up. It's all about versioning, right? You change your packaging, you change your product assortment, you've added new flavors or new colors or new formats for that item, and your system and your customers' systems are no longer synced up. And that was part of what the GDSN was. We've got this one version of the truth coming from the product owner. Apply that same logic here, right? For FSMA 204, getting data direct from the source about these FTL items that are moving through the supply chain and making sure that the data that you are sending, that you're able to collect it and send correct information to your trading partners. It's one thing to say I shipped you 100 pallets of tomatoes, but if I'm now needing to send you lot codes and TLC source information, that needs to align. When I receive those tomatoes and I open up the truck doors, does what you sent me either on paper or electronically match what's physically before me, what's coming into my warehouse? Because then that's going to affect my partners that I'm sending it to. And in the event of an FDA investigation, those pieces of information are so very important, right? It's not just that it's tomatoes, it's these tomatoes that they're looking for, and making sure that you're able to connect the dots and connect the data. Huge, huge, huge. So that data accuracy. The FDA has a new FAQ on their website. Somebody asked that question of, do you require 100% accuracy? And they answered it in the way that they need to because they're the FDA. But big picture, it's like, we need you to give us good data. To the best of your ability, this data needs to be as correct as possible.
Definitely. And I always find it interesting too, because I think there's still a lot of food companies that are not actually in, a software platform. Talk to me a little bit about that and kind of like what are some of the difficulties that folks are going to have with more manual processes with FSMA 204?
So certainly a lot of companies are having to look at kind of the back to basics, if you will. So making sure things like identification, so G10 assignment, those global trade item numbers that are assigned to your products. What are your processes? Are you following best practices for G10 management? Because that will then affect the data that you're sharing with your trading partners. So you can't have the same G10 for the 20-pound box of lettuce and the 30-pound box of lettuce. Those are two different items. So you need to make sure that you're following best practices for G10 management. You also need to make sure as I said before, a lot of trading partners are requiring enhanced labeling on products because they want to be able to automatically capture data through scans. So when we talk about things like SSCCs, which are serialized shipping container codes at the pallet level, or GS1 128 barcodes at the case level, you need to make sure that you understand, how do these barcodes work? How do I assign the numbers? How do I encode that information in the system? Because we are already, like right now, we are already seeing large grocer out there that is validating labels and making sure that they scan. And they're doing that now because back to that whole 30-month extension, if these don't scan, then they can't capture the data they need when they're doing order selection. And so when I'm pulling cases off of a pallet and I'm going to send 6 cases to one of my stores, I need every barcode to scan so that I can accurately capture that information. Well, they're doing that vetting and evaluation now and alerting their suppliers and saying, hey, this isn't working. I've also seen there are some distributors out there that not only are checking barcodes, but they have plans to fine their suppliers if they are not sending good quality barcodes, because that's going to directly affect their operations when they move forward and they're creating shipments that are then going to go out the door. So I strongly encourage companies, when you talk about like some of those risks and things that they need to pay attention to, when I say back to basics, things like G10 assignment and barcoding seem fundamental, but now they have just a white hot spotlight because of the dependency for capturing traceability data.
So we've done a lot of webinars talking about this, and some of the questions that we've been getting really have to do with complex supply chains. Perhaps being a restaurant that also manufactures their spaghetti sauce or things like that, and there's just kind of a lot that they have to consider. So what advice do you give for companies that have those more complex supply chains?
I mean, certainly the 80-20 rule applies here, right? If 80% of your business is the restaurant itself, you want to make sure that you get those processes, both are important, but get those processes and that you're focused on that main part of your business. But then if you do have a commissary or manufacturing other lines of business that are covered by the rule, that you're putting that same approach in place, that you need to have a traceability plan. You need to understand how you're going to capture the data. You need to make sure that you've got assigned team members, right, who own that traceability plan and the execution of the plan, as well as being able to run test investigations, right, and pull that data within 24 hours. So for many companies, they're managing these things at a corporate level, but there are teams at the different businesses that are actually running those programs, right? That are going to be the ones that are implementing the new processes and executing on those traceability plans. So making sure that you've mapped out your supply chain. I'm going to go back to the roles, that you've mapped out your supply chain and understand what things do we have to do? Because if you've got a manufacturing plant, you might be receiving FTL items, you're creating FTL items, and you're, transforming, and then you're shipping FTL items. So that's 3 critical tracking events. But there might be some hidden things, like you might do repack of FTL items and you're shipping product to your stores. Well, that's a transformation and a shipping event as well. So sometimes there are hidden events in your supply chain. So I encourage companies, map out your supply chain and look at some of those exceptions, store-to-store transfers, intra-company shipments, things like that are covered by the rule depending on how your facilities are set up, et cetera. A great example is college campuses. Understanding that food's coming into different parts of the campus, but then it's being moved to other locations. Products are being made in commissaries and then put into kiosks across the campus. There's a lot of complexity that you need to make sure that you understand what is covered by the rule and are these different scenarios that are part of your everyday business. Do we have to do that enhanced record keeping?
Yeah, I mean, when you start to kind of break it down, there's a lot of parts in that chain that, you have to consider. So absolutely. And, you mentioned kind of having different parts of the business. Another factor that comes into play, I think, is really those internal conversations that are happening within the company itself. And a lot of the, even the guests that have been on the show say it's so important to bring in all the stakeholders. Have you seen that as well? And kind of what advice do you have for people that are really trying to bring everybody into this conversation about traceability?
I mean, certainly you're going to have your core team for FSMA 204 that's driving your strategic direction, that's overseeing the implementation and the organization of different teams and team members and processes, et cetera. But then you have this whole group of subject matter experts that need to be brought in for different parts of those conversations. So if I go back to like the whole data quality, barcode quality, and things like that, that might be your data governance team, but it also might be some of your teams that work in your manufacturing plants, right? And that understand the label systems that you use and those tools that are in place today. And so there's definitely a cross-functional subject matter expert layer that is absolutely critical to your success. You need that core team to execute and put the plays together and the implementation plan and all that. But the expertise from the teams that are in your warehouses, in your grocery stores, in your restaurants, et cetera, is just as important, right? Because you need to make sure that you understand, here's our process today. What's actually happening? Do we follow this to a T, or have they modified it based on just environmental conditions and things like that? And then how do we apply that to FSMA 204? That is, these people know your business better than you do. So let them come with their ideas, come with their expertise. A great example is, this was a couple years ago, we were talking to some folks that were, right on the front lines in the processing plant. And we were talking about how they captured information for those transformation events. And they said, a couple years ago, we did a pilot and we had these handheld devices and we were able to scan things. I don't know why they took that away. And I'm like, I need you to say that let me capture this information. That's probably been it was a project that came and went, but she remembered the impact that it had on her job. And it's like things like that are so very important, because it's like, let's revisit that. How can we take those learnings and apply that to what we need to do now? We don't have to start from scratch. We've got someone who was there when this happened a couple of years ago.
That's a great example. And thinking about the future too, what do you see, obviously once that the rule is finalized but what do you see in the future for traceability and how are we going to get there?
Certainly with any program, this is true today, for many programs, for companies, is you're going to have the companies that are able to comply or are getting ready, and they will be there in July of 2028. But you're always going to have a company that's got, an ERP implementation underway, or they've got, they're putting in a new warehouse management system or whatever, and they might need alternate ways to send data. So the first thing I would say is, whatever plan you're putting in place, if you're doing EDI, if you're using a third-party solution, et cetera, what are the alternate methods that folks can use? And I think that's where, if we look at something like a Food Logic, for example, right now we have 7 different ways for folks to load data. And there's a reason for that, because oftentimes you need to meet companies where they are. They might be planning on doing APIs, but right now they have to use a CSV because those IT resources are on another project. So having the ability to participate sooner gives them a lot of learnings, but they're planning on doing this more advanced data loading later. And so I would say, don't be too restrictive on how you can connect with your trading partners, right? You need a little wiggle room for here's what we want most everyone to do. But for those who can't do that, we've got other options. That is true not only with data exchange, I've also seen that with labeling. Some companies don't have a giant, labeling system, et cetera. What are the other ways that I can create those GS1 128 barcodes and participate? Things like mobile apps, right? We've seen that with a lot of solutions where they've said, hey, my folks, all they have are cell phones. What can we do with cell phones, right? So I will say solution providers have been more and more innovative in the different options that they offer. Some of the bigger companies are building their own solutions to do similar things, but big picture, you want to have that availability. I would, on the other end of FSMA, for the end of chain partners, a lot of small mom and pop restaurants, they're covered by the rule. They've never heard of FSMA 204, but they're going to be relying on their distributors to help them with this. And so many distributors are looking at, okay, if I'm not actually sending you the data, I might print it on my invoice, but many are looking at, what other ways can I serve up the data? So a good example is here at FoodLogic, we've built an operator portal so that they can come get the data if they need it. And so with FSMA and kind of looking at some of those hurdles and milestones, it's like, what ways can I solve this, not just for one, but for many, right? So like having a portal that allows the less sophisticated, smaller company to be in compliance, but that they just don't have the same needs as, say, a restaurant chain that has 20,000 restaurants, right? Those are two very different scenarios. But on the flip side of that, it's like having access to that data, et cetera, helps you better understand your business. So whether I'm big or small, having that visibility, having that transparency, hopefully will help improve things like freshness of, those produce items or those seafood products, that it helps me better understand what's coming into my facilities and that I have better understanding when I tie that to my inventory management systems and things like that. So don't think of this just as compliance. There is a return on investment that really gives you transparency that maybe you didn't have today.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many benefits to it beyond just, complying that we see a lot too. So, thanks for sharing that. I think my last question, because you've given us so much information here, is really like, what else would you say people need to watch out for? What advice do you have? And how can they get prepared?
I mean, the first thing I would say is don't wait. You need to get started. And even if you are already started and you're looking at things that you're doing, how are things going? Evaluate where you are and set goals and milestones, right? That, here's when we need to have our supplier partners on board, and that directly affects the things that your teams will be doing. And so what things can you get started on? And then once you get that supplier data, how can you enhance and build on that and collect the things that you need to collect? So I would say don't wait until everything's perfect. Get started now. Suppliers, get ready to collect the data that you need to collect and get ready to share data that you need to share. And then on the back end is test your traceability plans and make sure that the steps that you've laid out, do they work? Because the FDA, if there's an investigation, they're not only going to ask for your data, they're going to ask for a copy of your traceability plan. And they're going to look at that plan and say, are they following this? Is this, here's where they said they are managing their data. Here's the person or the team that is our point of contact. Here's how they say that they assign lot codes. Is this all true? Does this align with what we're seeing coming from that company? So I can't stress that enough. Just like any other program that you put in place, right? Here's the plan. Here's how we think it's going to work. Test your plan. Make sure that it does, that you're able to do all the things that you've laid out and that your data, like I said, is accurate. It's not going to be perfect. You're going to find maybe there's a team that doesn't understand their role, or maybe there's a handheld that's not working or a barcode that doesn't scan. You want to prepare for those things now and put processes in place so that by the time we get to the new compliance date, that, hey, yes, we might have a barcode that doesn't scan. No sweat. We have a process where we follow up with the supplier, we get that fixed, and here's our turnaround for then getting back on track.
Yeah, excellent advice. Thank you so much, Julie, for joining us and getting us all back up to speed on FSMA 204. And I know if you guys want to hear more from Julie, she will be at our Reconnect conference in October 21st and 22nd. And we'll also have the FDA on to speak with us about this as well. So don't miss that. We'll put the link in the show notes so you guys can take a look at that and sign up. And again, thanks so much, Julie, for joining us.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And I hope that all of you who have listened today, this has provided you with some insights as you get started on your FSMA 204 journey.
Thank you for joining us for another bite-sized nugget of Food Tech Talk, supply chain insights from farm to fork. Make sure to subscribe. And if you love the podcast, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about Trustwell and request your free demo of our technology platform that connects food formulation, products, nutrition analysis, and compliant labeling with traceability, recall readiness, and supply chain transparency, please visit us at www.trustwell.com and click Get Started or click the link in the show notes to learn more. Thanks for listening.